Have you ever wondered how a single promise, spoken in the heat of passion, could unravel a Hollywood star's life and reshape the legal landscape for couples everywhere? Today we're going to explore the riveting story of legendary actor Lee Marvin and the tumultuous legal battle that introduced the world to the concept of palimony. This story is filled with twists and turns, heartbreaking revelations, and precedents that changed how millions of Americans view relationships outside of marriage. If you think you already know Hollywood drama, prepare to be amazed. Lee Marvin was a celebrated actor with a tough guy persona. He had a years-long relationship with Michelle Triola, who sued him for financial support after they split, claiming an implicit agreement to share assets. The case introduced palimony into pop culture, shook up common law marriage rules, and entangled not just Lee Marvin, but also the entire state's legal system in a battle over the rights of unmarried couples. And that is just scratching the surface. Stick around to learn how a bold legal claim, a flamboyant attorney, and one of Hollywood's biggest stars turned a personal dispute into a nationwide legal upheaval. Lee Marvin was born in New York City in 1924. If you picture him only in his cinematic roles, gruff-voiced, rugged, and brimming with an undercurrent of danger, you'd only be seeing part of the story. His formative years were full of unexpected twists that shaped him into the man the world came to know on the silver screen. Before Marvin ever thought of becoming an actor, he served in the United States Marine Corps during World War II. He survived the gruesome Battle of Saipan, where he was wounded and even spent a long period recovering from his injuries. Those wartime experiences gave him a distinctive resolve and a kind of unyielding grit, a quality that certainly came through in the roles he later portrayed. When he returned to civilian life, he stumbled into acting almost by accident. Initially, it was on the stage, treading the boards in regional theater and small New York productions. Directors and producers were struck by his unmistakable presence. There was something charismatic, if rough around the edges, that set him apart. Soon enough, Lee Marvin transitioned to film, finding a niche in westerns and war movies, genres perfectly suited to his gravelly voice and commanding demeanor. He became widely recognized for his work in films like The Dirty Dozen, Paint Your Wagon, and Cat Ballou. In Cat Ballou, he surprised critics and audiences alike, winning the Academy Award for Best Actor. That performance, curiously comedic, yet still rooted in a tough guy's sensibility, demonstrated the range of his talent. Despite the reputation he nurtured on screen, the hardened soldier, the stoic cowboy, the merciless criminal, people who worked with him or knew him privately frequently described him as warm, generous, and soft-spoken off-camera. These dualities in his personality were not just rumor or hearsay. Colleagues saw firsthand how he navigated the limelight. His stardom soared throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, cementing his place in Hollywood's pantheon of iconic tough guys. Outside of the studios, though, Lee Marvin's personal life was far from tranquil. A significant portion of this turbulence centered around his longtime relationship with a woman named Michelle Triola, later known to the public as Michelle Marvin. The pair had lived together from 1964 to 1970, all while Lee Marvin's career was skyrocketing. Though they never held an official marriage certificate, Michelle would come to argue that they had formed an implicit contract to share life and property, just like any traditional husband and wife. Before meeting Lee, Michelle had dabbled in the entertainment world herself as a singer and aspiring actress. Yet when they began living together, she claimed she set aside her own professional ambitions, taking on the roles of companion, confidant, cook, and anything else Marvin needed her to be to support his demanding career. Michelle even went so far as to legally change her name to Marvin, likely an effort to demonstrate her deep commitment and desire to be seen as his partner in a more tangible way. In the beginning, Lee Marvin provided her with some form of monthly support, though no formal arrangement existed on paper. When those payments suddenly stopped in 1970, right around the time Lee decided to marry someone else, Michelle believed she had been left high and dry despite half a dozen years devoted to him. Outraged and feeling betrayed, she took her grievances to a flamboyant Los Angeles divorce attorney named Marvin Mitchelson. Mitchelson had a knack for capturing headlines, often representing Hollywood celebrities, in divorce cases that bordered on the sensational. When Michelle approached him, the idea of suing for palimony, a term Mitchelson would soon popularize, was in its embryonic stage. The legal concept hinged on the argument that even without a marriage license, if a couple lived together and shared an understanding that they would pool resources and divide assets, then the partner left behind might be entitled to financial support. At first glance, this might seem an uphill battle. California had abolished the notion of common law marriage as far back as 1895. However, Michelle's legal team argued that, contract or not, there was a clear meeting of the minds between her and Lee Marvin, and that she deserved compensation for the lost years and for giving up her own career. The lawsuit was filed with astonishing demands. Michelle sought half of everything Lee Marvin had earned during the time they were together, an amount that, by her calculations, came to about $1.8 million. She also demanded $100,000 for the loss of her personal career, alleging she had turned down major opportunities, including a role in the Broadway musical Flower Drum Song on Lee Marvin's account. Although some witnesses would dispute those claims, the lawsuit immediately attracted public and media fascination. After all, Lee Marvin wasn't just any actor. He was a grizzled Hollywood icon, and now the question of whether his off-screen promises carried the weight of a marriage vow would be debated in open court. The case quickly evolved into a spectacle. Newspapers followed every twist, while legal commentators weighed in on the broader implications for unmarried couples across America. By 1976, the California Supreme Court gave a nod of approval to the concept that Michelle could, in principle, sue for what Mitchelson was calling palimony. This recognition kicked open the door for countless similar lawsuits. By 1979, when the case was finally heard in court, over 1,000 palimony claims were pending in California. Public curiosity soared, and it wasn't just because of the tantalizing possibility of large sums of money changing hands. It was also because the nation was in the midst of shifting social norms. Cohabitation without marriage was on the rise, and people were more comfortable questioning the traditional boundaries of alimony. Why should it only apply to married couples? In the courtroom, Lee Marvin's defense team tried vigorously to have the case dismissed, or at least limit its scope. They asserted that no implicit contract existed, and that if Marvin had truly wanted to marry Michelle, he would have done so in those 6 years. Judge Arthur K. Marshall refused to grant a dismissal, stating that the only difference between Michelle and Lee's arrangement and a conventional marriage was the lack of a license and a formal ceremony. Michelle presented a dossier of love letters, bank statements, and personal testimonies intended to illustrate just how intertwined her life had been with Lee's. She revealed she had been pregnant multiple times, aborting at Lee's insistence because he did not wish to be a father. In her view, each of these decisions and sacrifices testified to an unwritten pledge. What I have is yours, and what you have is mine. For his part, Lee Marvin took the stand and offered a very different perspective. He claimed he never promised Michelle anything beyond affection and companionship. Any talk of what's mine is yours was simply a romantic turn of phrase, not a legally binding vow. The name change, he claimed, was entirely Michelle's idea, and he had tried, unsuccessfully, to dissuade her. His defense tried to show that Michelle had never been a rising star who sacrificed major roles for Lee, calling into question her assertion that she gave up a promising career. Various nightclub owners testified that her singing wasn't particularly memorable, and dancer Gene Kelly even denied knowledge that she was being offered a role in Flower Drum Song. As the trial plodded on for 11 weeks, the tension grew. Mitchelson even attempted at one point to argue for punitive damages, up to $1 million, asserting that Lee had committed fraud by declaring a love he did not truly feel. The public lapped up every sensational detail, from love letters to accusations of broken promises. But overshadowed by the sensationalism was the simple fact that the outcome would set a legal precedent. If Michelle triumphed, unmarried cohabitation would effectively become as binding as marriage, at least in a financial sense. Once all the testimony and evidence had been presented, Judge Marshall had to make a ruling. He found that Michelle had failed to prove there was an enforceable oral or implied contract for sharing Lee's assets. Thus, he rejected her request for half of Lee Marvin's earnings during their relationship. However, he invoked the principle of remedy, awarding her $104,000 to help her re-educate herself and acquire job skills. This was a significant sum at the time, calculated based on Michelle's highest weekly singing salary before she became Lee's companion. It effectively amounted to $11,000 for each week over 2 years. The judge reasoned that Michelle had devoted time and effort to the relationship in ways that arguably set her back professionally, and she deserved a chance to regain her footing. Although Michelle didn't get the $1 million windfall she and her attorney had hoped for, the $104,000 was still a considerable chunk of money. Mitchelson, working on a contingency fee, was supposed to receive a percentage of any settlement. But because the judge's decision was so narrowly tailored, refusing to label it as alimony or property division, and sidestepping the question of half ownership of Marvin's earnings, Mitchelson's potential earnings dwindled dramatically. According to Time magazine, the amount he ultimately received was so low that, divided by the years he spent on the case, it boiled down to about $6.50 an hour, a pittance by Hollywood law standards. Mitchelson tried to get more money for his client, and by extension himself, either in the form of a higher settlement or at least coverage of Michelle's legal bills by Lee Marvin. Judge Marshall turned down these requests. Further attempts were made to get the state of California to compensate Mitchelson to the tune of $500,000, arguing that his work had established a new legal principle that would guide countless future cases of unmarried couples. The state naturally refused. Nevertheless, Mitchelson emerged with a moral victory. Palimony was now firmly in the public lexicon, and cohabiting partners across the country took notice. The day had come when romantic entanglements and financial entitlements were no longer exclusive to legally recognized marriages. It's worth noting that people often forget the cultural backdrop in which this was happening. The late 1960s and early 1970s saw a major shift in American social values. The rise of the women's movement, increased sexual liberation, and a broader questioning of traditional institutions all converged to make the Marvin v. Marvin case more than a simple Hollywood curiosity. It was a watershed moment highlighting how deeply American society was reevaluating relationships, commitments, and the legal frameworks meant to protect or define them. As more couples started cohabitating without formal marriage certificates, they were also charting uncertain legal territory. If one partner became financially reliant on the other, and then the relationship ended, Did that partner have any recourse? In the wake of the 1979 trial, the reaction was a swirl of confusion and excitement. Some believed the ruling would ensure justice for those who, like Michelle, gave up promising careers to support their partner's pursuits. Others lamented it as an attack on the sanctity of marriage, worrying that this palimony concept blurred the lines between legally sanctioned unions and casual living together arrangements. For a while, it was unclear how courts would interpret the notion of implied contracts going forward, or whether cohabiting couples should start drafting formal non-marital contracts to protect themselves. Then, in 1981, the Court of Appeals in California stepped in and overturned the $104,000 award. The appellate judges argued that Judge Marshall's justification for arriving at that specific amount lacked a clear legal basis. After all, awarding Michelle roughly $11,000 per week for 2 years came out of a principle that sounded suspiciously close to alimony, despite the judge's denials. This move by the appellate court dialed back the scope of the original decision, reaffirming that while palimony claims could be filed and potentially recognized, the actual awarding of damages had to meet stricter standards. In some ways, the appellate ruling made it clear that each palimony case would be highly fact-specific. If two unmarried people wanted to protect themselves, either in terms of property or spousal-like support, they needed to consider drafting explicit cohabitation agreements. Regardless of the appeals court's decision, by the early 1980s, the term palimony had lodged itself firmly in the national vocabulary. Michelle's case, though not winning her anywhere near the $1.8 million she once sought, still sparked critical conversations about the property and financial rights of unmarried couples. Single people moving in together began to examine their rights more carefully, realizing they didn't want to land in a protracted legal fight if the relationship soured. Meanwhile, couples who preferred not to marry for personal or ideological reasons felt newly empowered to define their arrangements on their own terms. Many attorneys started drafting living together agreements, outlining financial responsibilities, and specifying how property would be divided if the partnership ended. Some of these agreements even addressed other forms of intangible contributions, like domestic tasks or moral support. For Lee Marvin, who passed away in 1987 at age 63, the case left a complicated legacy. He remained beloved by fans for his roles, The Dirty Dozen, Paint Your Wagon, Cat Ballou, and many others that showcased his distinctive gritty charm. Off-screen, however, his name became synonymous with the question of whether promises made during cohabitation could translate into legal obligations. That association isn't entirely fair to the actor, who was, by many accounts, a generous, kind-hearted figure in real life. Yet the drama of the Marvin versus Marvin saga overshadowed much of his personal story in the public imagination. His side insisted that any commitment to Michelle was strictly emotional rather than legally binding. Michelle and her advocates, however, portrayed him as a man who dangled false hope to keep her loyal and dependent. The cultural interest in palimony cases didn't vanish after Marvin versus Marvin. In the years that followed, celebrities like Clint Eastwood, Bill Maher, and many others faced palimony-type claims, proving that the issue was no legal flash in the pan. Courts in at least 15 states had to grapple with some version of the question raised in Marvin versus Marvin. Can an unmarried partner claim a share of assets based on implied or oral agreements? Some courts recognized these claims under contract law principles, while others declined, sticking to the more rigid stance that absent a marital contract, no such obligations exist. In each instance, the far-reaching conversation that Michelle and Lee started reverberated in the background. The ripple effects extended beyond just the legal domain. For instance, popular culture latched onto the term palimony, sitcoms, late-night talk shows, and even stand-up comedians invoked it to draw laughs and debates. Americans became fascinated by the idea that you could owe someone money simply for living together long enough under the same roof, an idea that simultaneously horrified and intrigued many people. It also prompted more couples to consider prenuptial or cohabitation agreements as a protective measure, even if they had no immediate plans to marry. This shift in social consciousness reflects how a single court battle can rewrite the cultural script, influencing not just legal practice, but also how society at large understands relationships and responsibility. For Michelle, life after Lee Marvin was presumably complicated. Media interest spiked every time new developments arose. But once the case ended, especially after the $104,000 award was overturned, Michelle faded from the public spotlight. The general sentiment was that she had spent years fighting, only to walk away with no substantial payout. Mitchelson's own public image as a swashbuckling divorce lawyer to the stars wavered when his big bet on the Marvin case yielded much less financially than he had hoped. But he did secure his place in legal history books as the pioneer who brought the notion of palimony into mainstream awareness, prompting unmarried couples across the nation to ask themselves, should we have a contract? In the grand scheme of Hollywood legend, Lee Marvin's name often surfaces alongside the likes of John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, and Charles Bronson, actors famed for playing men of action, unafraid to walk into danger. But ironically, the biggest fight of Lee Marvin's life was waged in a courtroom rather than on any film set. It pitted him against a woman who had stood by him for 6 years, cooking meals, traveling alongside him, and possibly feeling every bit like his wife. When he decided to chart a different path and married someone else in 1970, Michelle found herself left without the security she believed was implicitly promised. Their disagreement, escalated by lawyers, judges, and the machinery of public fascination, set a benchmark that continues to influence cohabitation disputes to this day. We also shouldn't lose sight of the broader historical transitions happening during the Marvin era. With the women's liberation movement gaining momentum, more women started to question the traditional roles society laid out for them. Michelle's argument that she gave up a career for Marvin's sake reflected a phenomenon countless women experienced, sacrificing their own professional trajectories for the benefit or convenience of a male partner, with little to no legal protection if the relationship disintegrated. Although the court ultimately decided she didn't have enough proof of a contractual agreement, the principle that her time and labor held value was in many ways vindicated by Judge Marshall's awarding of the $104,000, if only temporarily until it was overturned. Moreover, the nation was coming to terms with a surge in non-traditional relationships. Baby boomers were rebelling against the constraints of their parents' generation, cohabitation rates soared, and even celebrities felt freer to remain single or live with their partners without tying the knot. The Marvin case underscored how the legal system was, at that time, ill-equipped to handle the complexities of such arrangements. It took bold moves by lawyers like Mitchelson and brave clients like Michelle to push the conversation into uncharted territory. To understand just how polarizing this case was, picture the jam-packed courtroom in 1979. Newspaper reporters sat shoulder to shoulder with curious onlookers, many of whom may have been living with a partner under similarly ambiguous conditions. When the judge declared that the only difference between the Marvins and a married couple was a piece of paper and a clergyman, it sent shockwaves. Was it possible that the law could one day treat long-term cohabiting couples exactly the same as married ones? Perhaps some legal experts caution we were a step closer to reintroducing common law marriage by another name, a concept California had abolished nearly a century earlier. Others, however, saw the case as an overdue recognition that relationships aren't one size fits all, and people deserve protection whether or not they chose to go through a traditional wedding. Even though the final result was a mixed bag, a short-lived award of $104,000 that was later revoked, Marvin v. Marvin remains a cornerstone in American legal history. The debate it ignited helped more people understand the necessity of clarity in relationships. If you want to keep finances separate, or if you intend to share everything, it's best to put it in writing, especially if substantial assets, large disparities in income, or major career sacrifices are involved. And that's the hidden triumph of this entire drama. It forced couples to communicate expectations. For some, it prompted an actual wedding. For others, it motivated them to draft a simple contract. In either case, it was a big step forward from the days when one person could simply walk away from a long-term relationship, leaving the other with no recourse. As the dust settled, the only undeniable loser seemed to be Mitchelson, at least financially. All those hours, all those dramatic court appearances, and all that media attention had resulted in the modest sum that scarcely covered his time. Still, from a career standpoint, he'd earned a place in the annals of family law. The palimony concept he championed generated over 1,000 lawsuits in California alone by 1979, and would eventually pop up across the country. Whether one views him as an opportunist or a visionary, he undeniably molded the legal strategies employed in relationship disputes going forward. In that sense, his role was pivotal. The final piece of the puzzle was the confusion left behind. Judge Marshall had insisted in his ruling that he wasn't establishing an automatic rule granting unmarried couples half each other's assets. Yet that's how many read it, at least initially. The overturn by the Court of Appeals 2 years later only added another layer of ambiguity. Couples began consulting lawyers in droves, desperate to know whether they were at risk of facing a palimony claim if things went sour. Others wanted to make sure that if they devoted themselves to a partner in a relationship without a legal certificate, they wouldn't walk away empty-handed. In that sense, the conversation sparked by Michelle and Lee has never fully abated. In reflecting on Lee Marvin's life, it's evident that his story extends far beyond the tough-as-nails persona we see in The Dirty Dozen or Paint Your Wagon. The real Lee Marvin was a multifaceted individual, shaped by wartime service, success in Hollywood, and personal relationships that tested his integrity and generosity. He died in 1987 at the age of 63, leaving behind a cinematic legacy that still resonates with fans of classic Hollywood. Yet the legal chapter of his life and the cultural phenomenon it sparked arguably impacted even more people than his films did because it touched on the universal questions of fairness, responsibility, and the meaning of commitment. So, where does that leave us today? The echoes of Marvin v. Marvin reverberate any time lawyers discuss cohabitation rights or draft living together contracts. Legally and culturally, we're more prepared to handle such cases now, thanks to the dialogue that opened up in the 1970s. Social norms have continued to evolve. More people than ever live together without plans for a formal wedding. Some states have recognized domestic partnerships or civil unions, aiming to extend certain rights to those who share a life without tying the knot. The notion that you could be financially responsible to a partner even without I do has become less shocking over the decades. But no matter how far we move on, the drama of that first high-profile Palimony battle lingers as a cautionary tale and a turning point. What's perhaps most captivating about the Marvin versus Marvin saga is the paradox at its core. A seemingly private matter between two individuals became a public cause célèbre that informed legal precedent for an entire country. The fact that Michelle was only partially successful and then effectively saw her award overturned didn't diminish the broader conversation. Instead, it intensified it. For better or worse, the dramatic details, the abortions Michelle claimed she undertook at Lee's urging, the love letters, the claims of missed career opportunities, the million-dollar fraud allegations, grabbed headlines. But the real legacy lay in exposing how precarious cohabitation could be without legal agreements. Before you go, consider this lingering question. If you were in Michelle's position, having devoted 6 years of your life to a partner who appeared to promise you everything, would you have done the same? Would you have sued? Or would you have walked away quietly? Or, if you were in Lee Marvin's shoes, falling in love but never intending a formal commitment, would you be prepared to face a courtroom battle over promises you might have made in earnest but never meant legally? The complexities of love and law have seldom been so clearly illustrated, and that's precisely why the Marvin vs. Marvin story remains as relevant and thought-provoking now as it was during its heyday. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the life of Lee Marvin and the extraordinary legal case that left an indelible mark on family law. It's fascinating how a Hollywood love affair could end up influencing the personal decisions of so many couples around the world. If you think this case was dramatic, just wait until we explore the aftermath in future episodes, where we look at other high-stakes battles that change the legal definitions of love, marriage, and cohabitation. Stay tuned if you want to learn more about the legal knots that celebrities tie themselves in, sometimes quite literally. After all, you never know which innocently uttered promise might spark the next revolution in family law. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your agreements in writing.